Hello guys, my name is Morteza, and in this video I'm going to talk about the React server components and server-side rendering, the differences between them, and how they work with each other. So let's get started. First of all, I'm going to explain how they work theoretically and then move on to different examples so I can show you how they implemented at a deep down level in frameworks like Next.js. Before we start, let's actually distinguish between React server components paradigm and server-side rendering because they are completely different approaches and but they are complementary to each other. So let's discuss it. React server components is a new paradigm that introduced in React. This paradigm lets us to run our components exclusively on the server. So we don't send them to the client and we just render them on the server. But in server-side rendering, we convert all of our components into a HTML file and then we send this HTML file to the client for SEO improvements and faster initial page load times. Okay, so that's the difference between RSC and SSR. For you to better understand these approaches, I wrote some information, some steps that these approaches take to show content of the page to the user. So let's take a look at them. For RSC alone, React Server Components. When client sends a request to the server, well, server renders just server components and then generates a data format. Basically, it's a special data format called RSC payload, which is a JSON-like data format, and it contains placeholder for our client components. Why placeholder? Because we can't render client components on the server, right? We can actually render them, but in RSC approach alone, we don't do that. We just uh, put a placeholder for client components inside of the RSC payload. And also it contains props passed from server components to client components and also server components themselves. So this RSC payload contains all of the information of our rendered components or server components and also client components. And server sends JS instructions for these client components alongside with RSC payload back to the client. Basically, we don't render the client components on the server, but we send the JS instructions for these client components to the client so that React can handle them on the client side. And then React hydrates and renders client components and shows the entire page. So that's how RSC works by itself. So if we take a look at an example of how RSC works, we can actually uh, take this example, which React team has provided for us, and it implements RSC alone, so it doesn't contain SSR, server-side rendering. So let's take a look at server-side code at first. And here, let's actually discard these contents. But the point that I want to mention is that we import the React app inside of our Node.js server, not on the client. And then, as I said, it doesn't contain SSR, server-side rendering, so there is no conversion to HTML, and we just send an empty HTML with, containing a div with root ID back to the client, and then we basically have a render React tree function here that creates an element from our React app. And what it does is it basically sends a response to that route slash React. And this is the actual RSC payload that we're sending to that slash React route. So I'm going to show you that if I come here in SRC framework router, and here you can see that we're basically fetching the slash React route to take the RSC payload. So I can show you that actually. Let's do let's actually store this fetch in some variable here. Fetch, oh, actually, let's call it promise and move it here. Let's consume that, promise that then we the text, because it's not JSON, it's just JSON-like format. It's not actual JSON. And I'm gonna console.log that value in the console. So let's see what happens. And this is basically a simple node app that we can create a new node, search for a node, and see a node, whatever. I don't care about the UI. I just wanted to show you the source code of this project. Okay, so let's wait for it. Okay, finished running Webpack. So let's see. Oh, you see that this is RSC payload. It's kind of like JSON, but it's not. And as I said here, it contains placeholder for client components. I can show you that here. Actually, let's go to our React app, app.js. You see that here we have a div with class name main, and we can see that here. So the first element is a div with class name main, and it has two children, this section and this section. And I'm actually interested in the first section because this search field is a client component, and I want to show you that a placeholder is here for that search field component. So you see that the third child of this section element, called sidebar, is this section with sidebar menu class, and I can show you that here you see that sidebar menu that has two children. You see, one children here and one another here. And these are the actual placeholders for these client components, $L1. This is the placeholder, and then React reads these placeholders and renders client components on the client. And as I said here, it also contains the server components as well. So you see that here, div with ID main is our app component, which is a server component. Okay, so RSC payload also contains server components. Okay, so that's for React server components alone. And the next thing that I want to discuss with you is traditional SSR. Or in Next.js, we had pages router, which was the time that RSC paradigm had not been introduced by the React team. So let's take a look at this one. Client first sends a request and server renders the whole app, all components. But in RSC, we basically had server components rendered on the server, not all of the components. But here, we rendered the whole app, all of our components. But the question that may come to your mind is that how can we render all of our components on the server, including components that handle event listeners like onClick event, whatever, use a state, use effect, that are meant to be used in client side? That is an interesting question. So let's take a look at another example. So I created a next project which is not using app router but uses pages router. So let's spin up this server cd next pages pm dev. So right now I'm in the home page of this project. We can see that this home page is basically a simple component that shows the static content, so it doesn't matter. But if I say console.log something, well, something, oh, come on, something, it shows that something on the client side, but it doesn't show that in the terminal. Although we say that we render all of our components on the server, but why don't we see that something logged on the server as well? Because we say that at the initial render, we render all of our components on the server, right? But the point is that server doesn't execute the JavaScript inside of our components. Basically renders this static content and renders and converts them to HTML and then sends it back to the client. And it also sends JS instructions, as I said here. You see that send HTML alongside with all of our components. And it also sends JS instructions for that components to the client so that React can render and hydrate all of our components. Although this traditional SSR solves most of our problems like SEO optimizations and initial page load times, but the problem with this traditional SSR is that we have to send all of our components back to the client. Although some of our components may not use any JavaScript inside of them, but we have to hydrate them at the client side because we don't separate our components to two different components like client components and server components like RSC approach. All of our components are the same and we have to hydrate all of our components at the client. So that's why RSC is invented for. We basically have some components that can exclusively run on the server and we don't send them back to the client. And the result is, well, a smaller bundle size. So let's take a look at this RSC plus SSR, React Server Components plus server-side rendering approach. First of all, client sends request to server and server renders both client components and server components. And as I said, it doesn't execute the code inside of client components because they are meant to be executed on the client, right? Like event handlers, use effect, use state, whatever. And in the next step, it converts these components to an HTML file and generates RSC payload based on that components and with the placeholder of whatever that I said here at the first time, RSC in the RSC approach. Okay, so that React can hydrate our client components based on that payload. And it sends HTML file with RSC payload and JS instructions for client components. An initial HTML is shown to the user, and then React hydrates HTML file and executes JS inside of client components. And this approach, RSC plus SSR, is implemented in the app router of Next.js. So this is an example of Next.js app router, and this is our homepage, which shows a hello world. And let's actually create a client component so that I can show you how this works. It's actually the same as traditional SSR, but with some differences that it also basically follows RSC paradigm. So let's say client component.tsx export default function client component. Yeah, thank you. And also use client. So this component is meant to be run at the client side. So let's actually console.log something. And let's import that here in our page, client components. Let's see what happens. Well, yeah, it basically shows our client component, and also it shows client component log that we had in our client component. And as I said before, the point that I want to mention is that both server components and client components get rendered on the server at initial time. Okay, for better load times. And I can actually prove you that Because if I come here to the debugger page and disable JavaScript, it works. And if I refresh the page, you see that client component, well, shows on the page, gets shown on the page, right? And that's why I'm saying that these components are rendered at the server. But if I come here to the console, there is no console.log. There is no client component log that we had here because our JavaScript is disabled. And that's all what I wanted to tell you about these different approaches. And thanks to Cloud AI, which helped me a lot with understanding these topics. And you can also come here and ask whatever question that you have from this AI, and it's really good. I promise you. Just try it out. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you in the next one.